Our second unit of study for this term is entitled A New Nation, covering the period of 1781 through the 1820s. Topics we'll be discussing: the Articles of Confederation, the Constitutional Convention, the ratification of the Constitution, the makeup of the Constitution itself. We will look at the presidencies of Washington, Adams, Jefferson, Madison, and Monroe, the ups and downs that they're going to have to deal with during their respective terms of office, the War of 1812, and finishing up with the era of good feelings. I hope you enjoy. Our first attempt at a true national government after the Revolution comes in the form of the Articles of Confederation. From 1781 through 1788, this will be our national government, and honestly, for the most part, there weren't a lot of bright spots. We'll look at the weaknesses here in a minute, but right off the bat, we've got the two bright spots for that. I mean, there's two pieces of legislation that we look back at as a national government, and this is some of the stuff they did well. Both dealing with land. It's the Land Ordinance Act 1785 and the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. Now, in the packet of information you received on the first day of the unit, I signed pages 1 through 5, and in that were some write-ups dealing with these two acts. And they're going to give you more specifics than I'm going to now because you're supposed to read that. But the Land Ordinance of 85 deals with the fact that all of the claimed land by the original colonies and the original states, they've gotten rid of it. I mean, we had land claims, to our western borders and the like, but states were going to cede that land to the national government, and this is how we're going to start dealing with this territory. Ordinance 285 deals with surveying. It's going to lay out the plots, how we're going to separate it, including provisions dealing with public education. But also, it decides that the new states were going to come in on equal footing. I think that's significant. I think you could make an argument for the original 13 colonies when they became states, that they would try to hold themselves above new states, but they chose not to do that. Instead, they wanted all the new states that were going to come in after them, and we knew there were going to be several. I mean, it's a pretty massive piece of territory to the west of the original 13 states, and they knew there were going to be new states, and they wanted them to be equals. So that's Land Ordinance of 85. The Northwest Ordinance of 1787 is dealing more specifically with what becomes Wisconsin, Illinois, Michigan, Ohio, and Indiana. So that big piece of territory, called it the Northwest Territory, because at this time, with Mississippi River being our western boundary, this was our Northwest, would be at least 3, but no more than 5 states. And the meat here, or the meat and potatoes, if you will, of this one, deals with the specifics for statehood. It actually gets into numbers, 5,000 male residents necessary to establish a territory with a governor, 60,000 residents with a constitution. It begins that process of this is the checklist to become a state. You've got to do this, check, do this, check. So it becomes the framework or the guidelines that we're going to continue to use throughout our history for what you need to do to become a state. So again, these are the two bright spots that we had to deal with from the Articles of Confederation. Well, I said it was difficult to find bright spots under the Articles. When you start looking for weaknesses, problems, they're not that hard to find. They pretty much jump off the page at you. After the Revolution, we have a significant debt. I've got there in the slide $42 million. We owed not just England, we owed France, we owed Spain, we owed the colonies, we owed colonists. I mean, we'd given, colonies had given loans to the Continental Army and Continental government. The individual citizens had, loaned money. The Continental Army had acquired supplies and paid only with IOUs throughout the war. So we owed a lot of money, but yet the government itself had no framework for collecting money to pay back that debt. Now, if you go back to the video we watched, that exchange with Mr. Adams and the British Foreign Secretary, the fact that we didn't want the British on our soil, we didn't like that the British maintained a significant influence within the colonies. Their response was, "You haven't paid your debts yet." So they weren't going to adhere to the Treaty of Paris of '83 until we were adhering to the Treaty of Paris of '83. So having that debt was a problem, and there was no mechanism for paying it other than asking the states for money. So you have your national government having to beg the states to give them money. So that was going to be a problem. We couldn't raise an army, but we could declare war. That was possible. But you had to rely on the state militias to carry out those fights. And there was a concern that some states may not join an army or join a war because of a different state. Would an army, created this way by just state militias, would a state militia cross state lines to go fight somewhere else? I mean, there were problems with that. There were concerns. The regulation of trade, one that I think we just kind of smooth past a lot of times, but which is unfortunate because the trade issue is such a big one, and that was part of the video itself early on, where it showed not just Adams and the foreign secretary, but the scene that depicted the traders at the docks, and that wasn't your original offer. Well, I'm not going to pay for that. Not having the ability to negotiate trade deals for your nation was problematic. England was going to be able to take advantage of the situation. We could not avoid England. It wasn't like, well, fine, just don't trade with England. Not an option. We'll see that here in the years to come. We tried that. Doesn't work. We suffered when we don't trade with England. England didn't suffer without us. We suffered without them. We're not self-sufficient. So if we can't negotiate a collective trade deal for all of the colonies, that left the states to do it for themselves. And if England's got 13 states to deal with, they have that advantage. They offer Virginia a specific trade deal, and Virginia doesn't like it. It's not like Virginia's got a lot of options. And for England, they can say, well, hey, we offered that same thing to North Carolina and they accepted it. Or we're going to make the same deal to Massachusetts, or whatever. They could play the colonies against each other to get the best deal for them in England. Because we had no strength in numbers, because we had no mechanism for collective bargaining, we were going to suffer. Lack of branches of government. We could pass laws, sort of, but we couldn't enforce them. We couldn't, administer justice based on them. It took 9 of 13 states to agree to pass a law. And, again, there's another problem. Every state had one vote, regardless of the number of representatives they sent to the assembly. Every state got one vote. So if you've got 10 representatives from Virginia, those 10 have to come together to cast one. So even then, you're going to see states being split. It's going to be division within the states themselves, which is going to lead to problems within the Congress. Amendments are going to take 13 out of 13. So we created a government that was heavy on the side of states' rights or states' power, but very limited when it comes to national. So as a national government, it was almost impossible for it to function. After looking at the weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation, it's obvious to us that something needed to happen, but during that period, states were very reluctant to get rid of the authority that they had. They had fought the revolution in part to oppose a king, and they were afraid of creating a king here in the United States itself. So the fear of a centralized government was more prevalent then than it is today. One of the problems that's going to happen that's going to help inspire some of our leaders that maybe it is time to change, maybe we do need to create a more nationalized, more federalized government. We had riots, we had burning of buildings and armed revolt in several of the states, but the one that gets the most attention typically is Shays' Rebellion. Daniel Shays was a Revolutionary War veteran in Massachusetts, and he led a revolt of Western farmers who were disgruntled over the tax policies. So, you heard, no taxation without representation, echoing again. And in this case, again, they're going to pick up arms, and it's the scene that was depicted in the video we watched where they were firing over their head, then firing into the ranks. But Shays' Rebellion, for some, was a problem because of what potentially could happen next. What happens if the next group are more organized? What happens if the next group is not a group but a state itself? And what happens if it's, the state is not fighting amongst itself, like a civil war within a state? What happens if a state attacks a second state? What happens if a rebellion crosses state lines? And the reality that came to several of our founding fathers here was we didn't have a mechanism to deal with that. The national government wasn't strong enough. There was no military force there that we could use to put down such rebellion. So this did help spark the discussion and the debate for needs to at least alter the Articles. In the fall of 1786, there was an attempt to have a conference in Annapolis, Maryland, dealing with commerce and trade, but yet you couldn't get enough people there. They never reached the point of a quorum, which is the term we use for minimum number of people necessary to conduct business. So these types of events going on, finally there will be a call for a convention, and it's held in Philadelphia, summer of 1787. Independence Hall, same building from the Continental Congress, same building from the Declaration of Independence. The delegates themselves, there were 74 delegates. 55 showed up. Rhode Island did not send anyone. I read to you in class a list dealing with the makeup of the Constitutional Convention itself. 21 were, of the 55 men that attended, 39 signed the final draft, 14 left before the convention closed, 3 refused to sign, 21 were 40 or older, 14 were 50 or older, 21 of them were 40 or younger, my apologies, 14 were 50 or older, with Mr. Franklin being the oldest at 81. Average age was 41. 47 were colonial natives, 31 had attended college, Princeton, Yale, William & Mary, Harvard, King's College, which is Columbia. 21 had military service, 18 in the Continental Army, 10 had been members of the Society of the Cincinnati, 1 had been a British Army officer, 34 had studied law, 13 in business, 10 were planners, 3 were physicians, 2 were clergy, 46 had been in their state legislatures, 3 had been at the Stamp Act Congress, 10 as part of their constitutional conventions from their states, 42 were delegates to the Continental Congress, 3 had been executive officers of the Congress, 8 signed the Declaration of Independence, 6 signed the Articles of Confederation, 7 had attended the Annapolis Convention, 7 had been governors, and 1 had been a minister abroad. All white, all male, all men of privilege and means. And this was the group that was supposed to come together to create our new government. The video talked about secrecy. I talked about it while we were watching it. The idea of the freedom to discuss and debate. I think it's significant, it's important. Washington was selected as the president of the convention mainly because of his leadership. There was a belief, there was a trust, the belief that he was not going to allow anything bad to happen. There's so many, several of the states, they refused to attend unless there was some kind of a guarantee that Mr. Washington would be there. So his being in charge is important. And then Madison, I've got there that he's the man. He is the father of the Constitution because he showed up with a plan. Then Jefferson and Adams were not there. They were serving overseas. Patrick Henry refused to come because, in his words, he smelt a rat, which, in the end, he was right. And then John Hancock didn't show up because he was governor of Massachusetts at the time. But the thing that I like most about the video we watched on the More Perfect Union is that it does show the need for compromise, and at different times it talks about the need for compromise, because as a nation, especially in today's society, we've lost sight of the need for compromise. We're more than happy to govern with simple majority rather than trying to govern with everyone's ideas in mind, trying to be a united country. But a couple of the compromises, the Great Compromise is one they spent the most time, obviously, and you should have a basic understanding of the Great Compromise, because the primary issue was the way that we established the representation in Congress. The large state plan, Virginia plan, called for both houses of Congress to be filled proportionally. The New Jersey plan wanted to fill fill on the basis of equality. So what we end up with in the end was, thanks to Mr. Sherman from Connecticut, Roger Sherman's his name, he's the one that introduced this idea of the Connecticut plan, which was one house of each. Again, to us, it makes sense. But to them at that time, it was win at all cost. And ruling, again, the idea of ruling with a consensus versus ruling with majorities, simple majorities, again, the consensus is going to win out here. The other issue is that of slavery. Now, the 20-year moratorium, that's one of the topics covered in the video. The southern states refusing to yield on the issue of slavery. They were going to continue slavery. Their economy was based on slavery. But they were willing to throw out there that this 20-year moratorium. So during that 20-year period, the government could do nothing to stop the foreign slave trade. But at the end of that 20 years, then the foreign slave trade could go away. The other part of this is, how do we count slaves? There are two reasons to count people in general in the Constitution. First is the counting of the people for representation. So we take the census every 10 years, and we determine how many people each state has. That's how we determine the number of representatives that state gets in the House of Representatives. So we have to count the people. Well, southern states wanted to count the slaves towards representation. Obviously, that would have given them a greater number of seats. That would have given them more power in the House. Obviously, the non-slave holding states were against that, because by counting the slaves, when you count the population of people that you're using to affix this representation number, there's the assumption that those people are citizens and they're voting and all that. Well, slaves weren't considered citizens; they're considered property. So you can't count them for that. So we're in an impasse. The other reason for counting people in the Constitution is for the purpose of taxation. Before the days of income taxes, states' responsibility tax-wise was based on their numbers. Again, taxes were fixed proportionally. So the more people in your state, the more taxes your state was going to have to come up with. Well, for this reason, the North wanted to count slaves, adding to the tax burden of the southern states. Whereas the Southerners, they don't want to count the slaves for the purposes of taxation, because slaves don't pay taxes, but the slave holders then would be held accountable for those taxes. So, again, we're at an impasse. And what they are going to work out is we will count slaves for both representation and taxation, but not at a 1-to-1. Not to where, the black one slave is equal to one white. Instead, they came up with this idea called the 3/5 compromise, in which 5 slaves would count as 3 whites, or each slave is worth 3/5 of a person. Not our proudest moment as a nation when we talk about slavery, but again, this is one of those issues that we had to get through in order to get the Constitution put into place. Other issue dealt with was the idea of import taxes or export taxes, and this is another one of those decisions. States were placing import taxes on other states. You have to pay that tax in order to sell your product there in that in the other state. But states would also place export taxes. So if you were from Maryland and you wanted to sell your product to Delaware, Maryland would charge you a tax to send it to Delaware. And we were taxing things coming and going. And the group there in Philadelphia determined that maybe that wasn't the best way to do things. So instead we began taxing only products as they are entering the states. So collectively, we could only use import taxes. We call those tariffs, but no export taxes. Now for the overall system that we're creating. This is going to sound a little bit more like a government lecture than a U.S. history lecture, but it's the history of our government. We created a federal system, and all that is a two-tiered system, meaning we have a federal law as well as state laws. Now, in our system, we are establishing that the national government is supreme. It's in there. It's Article 6, Section 2. It's the Supremacy Clause. But that doesn't mean that the states don't have some rights. The states don't have some powers. The states still retain some authority. That's the federal system. It's two-tiered. It's federal and state governments. Now, oftentimes we like to refer to ourselves as being a democracy, from the Greek demokratia, government of the people. The reality is we aren't a democracy. We are actually a republic. The idea of the republic is simply we elect people to make decisions for us. We're too big for a democracy. We're too, not just in population, but also territorially. It doesn't make sense, especially today when you're looking at, the Atlantic to the Pacific plus Alaska and Hawaii and 350 million people, and all the places in between. It's just not realistic. So our right to vote for our electors is where we practice our version of democracy. We're a democratic republic, if you will. But it also allows them, by us selecting our leaders, we're still the source of the power. So, in order to keep that power in Washington, you've got to come back through the voters eventually. The three-branch system, the separation of powers, again, this is stuff that you should have learned long ago. We have a legislative branch, an executive branch, and a judicial branch. Okay, legislative makes the laws. That's the one that he deemed to be too powerful for one body, so he split the power to make laws into two groups. The legislative branch is the most powerful of our government. The executive branch, their job is to enforce the law. This is the figurehead. This is the one most people think of when we talk about the United States government. If you were to, again, the whole close your eyes and think of the government with one face, it's the president's. But they're not, in theory, the president's not supposed to be as powerful as Congress. But again, Congress is spreading that power over 2 houses and currently 535 individuals. The third branch is the judicial branch. It's the court system. Their job is to interpret the laws, administer justice. Now again, the idea of separation of powers is that no one group within the government can gain total control. Okay, we place limits on our government. And to ensure this separation of power, we have established what are called checks and balances. And it's just simply that every branch has some power or control over the other branches. So it's the president vetoing a law passed by Congress that he doesn't agree with. It's the courts declaring a act of Congress unconstitutional. It's the judicial, or it's the legislative branch, specifically the House, impeaching a president who's breaking the rules. They each have some modicum of control over the others, and that's the idea behind checks and balances, to ensure our separation of powers. Now, if you can't tell or you haven't been able to tell during class, I do enjoy talking about the Constitution. It's one of those subjects I've taught government and the Constitution itself probably more than anything else in my teaching career, just because teaching the Constitution in multiple classes in government and U.S. history at the same, I do enjoy talking about it. And one of the things I've always found fascinating about our government is its flexibility. And you think about, the Articles of Confederation were completely the opposite. It was a rigid system of government where 9 to 13 states required to pass laws, 13 states required to amend the articles. It was a government that couldn't get out of its own way to govern. Whereas the Constitution, we've created a system for amending, where we're physically changing the Constitution, either adding language to, altering language of, or deleting language in some cases. But we've created a method where it's possible to make changes that we need, but at the same time, we're not going to allow the changes we don't. Now, it's a two-tiered system. It's got to be proposed by Congress. Typically, that's the path we take. There's two ways of doing it, but typically it goes through Congress with got to have 2/3 vote of both houses to propose, and then it's sent to the states for ratification, and that takes a 3/4 vote. So the votes aren't simple majority; they're more so. So it's a little more difficult to get to a 2/3 vote or a 3/4 vote of the states. So again, you kind of don't have to deal with some of the crazier ideas. Those are we're gonna push those to the side. Those are going to be tabled. Those will be killed in committee, what have you, because they can't get the necessary votes. But it does allow us to make the changes we need at the time. So amendment process is about, again, it's the physical change. And we've only done that 27 times. Again, Bill of Rights, 1 through 10, our first 10 amendments. That was ratified in 1791. So since 1791, we have only changed our Constitution 17 times. 2 of those cancel each other out. 18 and 21, that's prohibition, repeal of prohibition. So again, realistically, we've only changed the Constitution 15 times since 1791. To me, that's amazing. When you look at other countries, around the world and the number of governments they've had, not changes in leadership, but just changes in government. Look at the French Revolution itself. In the same time frame as the American Revolution, just a few years after us, they're going to go through a period of 7, 8, different governments, where we've only made 15 substantive changes to ours in 200 years. Now, the reason our government's so flexible, the reason why we haven't had to make so many changes through the amendment process, is we did incorporate this idea of the elastic clause. Under the Articles, there was, we looked at the list of powers Congress didn't have. They couldn't raise an army, they couldn't tax, they couldn't regulate commerce. Well, in our Constitution, we do have a list of things Congress can do. It's the powers given to Congress. It's Article 1, Section 8. And the first 17 clauses are the specifics. We can declare war. We can raise an army. We can tax. We can declare standards of weights and measures. We can grant letters of marque and reprisal. That's right. We can sanction pirates. But we list those specific things that we get to do as a country or as a Congress. But then once you get to 17, there had to have been that thought process amongst the founding fathers that they could continue to list stuff all day long. And they were never, ever going to list everything that Congress was going to need. There's no way to foresee every contingency through the history of our country. There were things that were going to happen that weren't going to be covered, and they needed to find a way to cover it. That's Clause 18. Congress is given the power to do whatever they consider to be necessary and proper to administer their duties. Some refer to it as the necessary and proper clause. I prefer the elastic clause. It's the same thing. It gives them the power to do what needs to be done. And we are giving that trust to Congress not to abuse this authority. Because again, necessary and proper, the definition depends on who's asking the question. or who's answering that, I guess. It's limitless. So we've got a lot of trust here, but again, we put our trust in a body divided into two groups. We've put that trust and we've spread that over a large number of people, again, with the hopes that they won't abuse it. So the elastic clause stretches the Constitution without physically changing it. It's still the same Constitution, but that's where so much of our flexibility comes from. The idea of separation of church and state is one that's more popular or more prevalent today, I believe, than it was back in the 1780s. But I think it's important whenever they start declaring separation of church and state, and they tell you to look at the Constitution, look what the founding fathers said. It's in there. It was important to them, and I think it is important to go back to the document sometimes and just see what it says about things. The phrase separation of church and state, okay, or the wall of separation between church and state, does not come from the Constitution. On the slide right here, you see what the Constitution says about church and state. Article 6, Section 3, deals with the idea of a religious test as a requirement or a qualification. So you don't have to be a member of a church in order to hold public office. Nothing there about wall of separation. First Amendment, no laws respecting the establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Again, no language there about wall of separation. We're not going to establish a church. There's going to be no government established church, and they're not going to get in your way of exercising your religious faith however you choose. Okay? That's where the Constitution deals with religion specifically. The idea of the wall of separation comes from a letter written by Thomas Jefferson to the Danbury Baptist Church in response to a letter that they wrote to him. Now, you have those letters in your packet. I'm not going to reread that stuff to you. But again, I think it's important that when people say that separation of church states in the Constitution, well, there is a little bit there in the language. But it's not about religion separated from government. The language in the Constitution is about government separated from religion. There will be no government in your religion. It's not saying there will be no religion in your government. And I think it's important to understand the difference there. And to understand that the idea of the wall of separation isn't constitutional. It was written in a letter between Jefferson and a church. The ratification of the conventions of 9 states shall be sufficient for the establishment of this Constitution between states so ratifying the same. That is the language of Article 7, the final article of the Constitution itself. Calls therefore 9 of the 13 to ratify, and then it gives you the means, or at least the method, or should I say, who is going to be the one ratifying. It says conventions, and I underlined that because I think that's an important aspect. The Founding Fathers could have simply said that the state governments could ratify this. But in doing so, they would be putting the state governments in a position where they would be choosing between the current national government, in which the states had all the power, and a new national government in which the national government had most of the power. So that the state governments did not have to put themselves in that situation where they were choosing to give up authority. They bypassed the state governments and took this straight to the states by convention. Didn't take long for us to take sides. Once this is sent out to the several states, if you were in favor of the Constitution, you were a Federalist. If you were against the Constitution, this is really original, I know, you were an anti-Federalist. Once the fight for ratification began, the Anti-Federalists are going to have two basic arguments against ratification. One is that the group that met in Philadelphia did not have the authority to do what they did. They were not authorized to scrap and start over. They were not authorized to nullify and void the Articles of Confederation. For that argument, the Federalists were pretty straightforward. They didn't care. Yes, we did that. No, it doesn't matter. We need to judge we need to ratify or not ratify the Constitution based on the merits of the Constitution itself, which is a better form of government. They really, again, they didn't deny and they didn't apologize for what they did. So they didn't care about that first argument. Second argument dealt with the idea of a lack of a Bill of Rights. We saw in the video we watched on the Constitutional Convention, George Mason was the gentleman that got up there at the end from Virginia and talked about the lack of a Bill of Rights. Federalists typically went, well, yeah, but the state constitutions already cover that. Well, the problem with that, and when we talked about in class, is this idea that if you're creating a national government that is the supreme law of the land, okay, Article 6, Section 2, the Supremacy Clause, if you're creating a national government that has all the power, then there needs to be some kind of a national guarantee, a federal guarantee. States can guarantee rights all they want, but if you're saying that the federal government and everything else is superior, has the right to, get rid of state laws because, if there's a conflict, federal wins every time, no questions asked. There has to then be a federal guarantee. This will be one of those that, an argument that the Federalists, they're not going to win, but they are willing to give in to this idea of a Bill of Rights, but after ratification. Their agreement with the Anti-Federalists is that's fine, we can do that. We can create a national Bill of Rights, but we need to ratify the government first. And that's, again, what's going to happen for the most part. Both sides are going to use whatever means necessary to get their idea across. You looked at Federalist number 10, which was an essay written by Madison, talking about the merits of the government, of the Constitution. And that's just one of 85 essays written by this group called the Federalists. John Jay, Alexander Hamilton, and James Madison were the authors of the Federalist Papers to try to convince the voters. But in the end, we will get the ratification, but the Anti-Federalists do get the guarantee that we will then create a Bill of Rights. The first state to ratify will be Delaware. If you go back to the map quizzes we started with, that was the first state on the list. If you're a collector of the state quarters, you know that Delaware was the first, because we based the admission into the Union for the first 13 states on their time or when they ratified the Constitution. So Delaware is the first state. Number 9, New Hampshire. Important because, again, it takes 9 of the 13. Still had some issues there because our 2 largest states had failed to ratify it at that point. So we had 9 states, but no Virginia and no New York. They would come later. For Virginia, just a few days later. For New York, a month later. In 1789, I believe it was November of 1789, we had North Carolina, and then the final of the original 13 would be Rhode Island. Rhode Island, the last there in 1790, they did not want to ratify the Constitution. They didn't even attend the convention. They're the only state that did not send a delegate. But by 1790, they really didn't have much of a choice. So we've got our 13 states, we've ratified, now we've got to start a government. This is usually considered the most appropriately named slide that I have all year. I know how most of you feel about dates, and I typically try to avoid a lot of dates in history class because I think you can get lost in focusing on dates and not necessarily focusing on the bigger picture, the main ideas, if you will. But I just want to give you kind of a timeline of what happens next, because now that we've got the Constitution, it's been ratified, we then have to go through the process of putting things into place. You have to have elections. Before you can have elections, you need election laws. Some of the states are going to have to make some changes there. Prepare for this. You can't just have an election on June 22nd because New Hampshire ratified the Constitution on June 21st. It's going to take us until February to have our first presidential election. March is when our first Congress begins its term of office. The president doesn't take office until April. And then we don't have a Supreme Court meeting until February of 1790. And again, it takes time to put things into place. Once the president takes office, then you can begin filling the Supreme Court. Problem with that is the Constitution doesn't even tell us how big the Supreme Court was going to be. It was going to take an act of Congress to tell us that it was going to be 5 members, and then the president could nominate those people, and then the Senate still had to ratify. So again, it took time to put this into being. It wasn't, again, like day, 2 days, 3 days, a week. We were going to have this ready to go. The last date, of course, being the Bill of Rights, the promise to the anti-federalists that there would be a federal guarantee, and that's not going to take place, or those aren't going to be ratified and become officially part of the Constitution until 1791. So you're looking at a little over 4 years from the Constitution being signed until the Bill of Rights are added and our 3 branches actually being fully functional. No, I did not misspell president. I did this on purpose. Before we went through this slide in class, we did watch the President's series on George Washington, our first president, the only president ever to be elected unanimously in the Electoral College, and he did that twice. Served 2 terms, 1789 to 1797, and as president, he did establish or did set several precedents for the office. And that's one of the things the video touched on. There's a quote from President Washington, and I believe I put it on the cover of your packet, where it talks about, he talks about walking on untrodden ground. And he's talking about the fact that he is leaving footprints for those to follow. He knows that what he's doing is laying that path, that foundation, or whatever you want to call it, for everybody else. Now, as president, he doesn't have anybody to look at. He can't say, well, what did the last president do? Because he's the first president of the United States, at least in this form, with these powers. So everything he did was going to be a precedent for the next president. So I have shared that video. It's on the blog. I believe I put it on that day's post, but I also have it in the links. If you want to go back and watch some more specifics about this, please do so. I recommend it. We will, by the time this is all said and done in class, we will have watched all 5 of the presidents. Constitution says that the president can receive advice and consent from his executive departments, but it doesn't establish any executive departments. It gives Congress the power to do that. So that's one of the things that our first Congress was going to have to do, is create some of these executive offices. The first 4 we get are Secretary of State, Secretary of Treasury, Secretary of War, and then our Attorney General. State will be, of course, Thomas Jefferson. Treasury is Alexander Hamilton. War is Henry Knox. And Attorney General is Edmund Randolph. They will be part of that inner circle for Washington. James Madison, who was a member of the House, would also be part of that inner circle for Washington. In fact, he and Alexander Hamilton wrote a lot of the addresses given by President Washington. As far as the Bill of Rights and fulfilling that promise, Madison would help oversee that project while he was in Congress. And of the 500 suggested, 200 proposed, narrowed down to 12, we will get to 10 ratified. Now, in class, I showed you this list of the original 12. The original First Amendment dealt with representation in the House. And by dealt with representation, I mean it got into the numbers. After X number of representatives a state receives, or X number of population, they would get this. And it was never ratified. The Second Amendment on that list dealt with congressional pay raises. It wasn't until the Third Amendment on the original list that we get the 5 freedoms of religion, press, speech, assembly, petition, the things we know as our First Amendment rights. Originally, that was going to be the Third Amendment. And, the subsequent amendments were all, so Second Amendment was actually going to be the Fourth Amendment. And the Third Amendment was going to be so you can do that in your head. So again, our first 2 amendments were not ratified, at least not then. The First Amendment never has been. What was originally going to be our Second Amendment was not ratified until 1991, which is a kind of a quirky story in and of itself, and that's more of a government class story, so I'll save that for then. The last thing here on the first Congress is the idea of the Judiciary Act. Again, Congress did not establish, or excuse me, let me say that again. The Constitution did not establish levels of court system. It didn't create the district courts. It didn't create the circuit courts of appeal. All the Constitution does is create a Supreme Court with a Chief Justice. But in that, it doesn't even say how many judges are in the Supreme Court. So all that stuff had to be worked out by our first Congress, creating that framework and getting some of the specific details in place. This slide is fairly self-explanatory. We talked about this in class. We had the quiz on it as well. There's also a chart and 1 page or so write-up in your packet dealing with these early political parties. I think the biggest thing to remember is as we started implementing the different aspects of the Constitution and passing legislation and making the decisions necessary to govern a nation, political parties, while they're not necessarily part of our Constitution, doesn't say we have to have political parties. It's just the reality. We're going to have differences of opinions. And in this case, you're looking at a Federalist side that wanted a strong central government with a lot of power, loose interpretation of the Constitution kind of power where they can do lots and lots of things, versus the Republican side or the Democratic Republicans of Jefferson wanting more state power, wanting a limited national government, smaller in scope, and more fiscal responsibility and things of that nature. So this is one of those, as we talked about at length. You have multiple things to look at, and should be fairly self-explanatory. As the Secretary of the Treasury, it fell to Hamilton to help establish a financial plan for this country. A couple of things he wanted to do here. The first there, it says assumption. Now, this is a term they used in the video dealing with George Washington and the presidency. Assumption means we're going to assume the debts that have been accrued by both the federal and the state governments. Hamilton thought it was necessary not only to pay the debts we had, the debts we had from the Revolution through the Articles period, but he also believed that it was the federal government's responsibility to pay the debts of the states at this point, establishing national power. And then this is the reoccurring thing with Hamilton. The reoccurring theme is that of establishing and then building on a national power. He is a federalist. He wants a strong central government. So this idea of assuming the debts of the states helped place them in that position. He also wanted to see the passage of a series of excise taxes. An excise tax is simply a tax on domestic product. Think the tax that we put on cigarettes, gasoline, alcohol today. We have specific taxes for products. Those are excise taxes. He called for all war bonds to be paid in full to whoever held the bonds. We talked a little bit about this in class. There was an issue going on with bond speculators. People were afraid that when the economy was not doing well under the Articles, that potentially we would not pay our war bond debt. So there were some people, though, that were speculating that those bonds would eventually be paid. So you had people who were buying up war bonds for pennies on the dollar. I think I used the example if somebody had a $50 bond and paid $25 for it, a speculator may come in and pay them $5 or $10. So they're taking on a lot less of the investment. But the question became, once they're going to pay these debts, who do you pay? Do you pay the person who initially bought the bond, or do you pay the bondholder, or do you pay the bondholder just what the face value was, or do you pay them just what they invested in it? There was a lot of questions, and Hamilton was very adamant. We pay the bondholder, whoever has the bond, and you pay them what the face value is. Doesn't matter if they were a speculator or not. They hold the bond, you pay the bond. Government would fund support industry, commerce. These are the things we weren't good at. The manufacturing and that sort of thing. Those are areas of our society that we were dependent upon the British. We were dependent on foreign trade and the like. So we needed to improve in those. So those things needed to be supported by government. Whereas the agricultural side of things, we were already pretty good at. So the government didn't need to support, fund, finance, whatever. The other aspect of this is the national bank. And this is one of those that for the Republicans, they're really going to struggle with this idea because nowhere in the Constitution do you have the right to create a national bank unless you use the elastic clause. Now, again, Hamilton, Federalists, loose interpretation. They were not, they were willing to use the elastic clause, early and often. But according to Hamilton, you needed that bank to be the centralized piece to deposit monies, to grant loans, to deal with the tax revenues. We needed a centralized bank that was just for the government. Without it, he didn't believe his plan was going to be would work. But that was the key piece. And again, it's going to take a fight with the Republicans to get this done. Of course, there's going to be opposition, and the opposition came in the form of Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. Their issue with assumption is simple. Several of the southern states had already paid their debts. So now the federal government was asking these southern states to help pay the northern debts. Now, southern states were an advantage in this situation because southern states had a pretty solid economic system through their agricultural exports, whereas the northern industries were still, trying to take shape, trying to take hold. So economically, they were going to struggle. So the South is going to have issue with the North in this situation. Now, as it says there, agreed after deal on capital location decided. If you remember back to the video with Washington, it did talk about Washington kind of negotiating this compromise, whereas the southern states would agree to pay the northern debts. So the southern states would agree to this idea of assumption, but in return, the placement of the permanent capital would be in a southern state or in a southern territory. And that's how we get Washington, D.C., as taken out of right there in the border between Virginia and Maryland. Other aspects that Hamilton's going to oppose. He doesn't like the promotion of commerce over ag. Again, Southerner plantations, the belief that we are best at this and we need to focus on what we're best at. He did not believe in paying speculators. He thought that was unfair. That people who had bought the bonds initially should be the ones that are repaid, even though nobody made them sell the bonds. And again, he was against the idea of creating a national bank simply on the basis of it being unconstitutional. But you also have an aspect as far as the bank is concerned with a lot of Southerners, just in general. There were not a lot of banks nationally at this point. I mean, private banks, family-owned or privately owned banks, there just weren't a lot in the southern states. For most Southerners, your bank was your property. If you had money, you instead of investing or putting it in the bank, you would buy land. Now, land goes up and down in value, kind of like, the markets are concerned. But then if you ever needed money, you would just sell part of your territory, sell part of your land. That's how you would withdraw your money. But for them, that's how you invested. That's how you saved. It wasn't, this, idea of a bank. So, for the rural economies, the agricultural driven areas, the idea of the bank was just, I don't want to say it was foreign completely, but at the same time, they just don't trust it as much. Now, when it comes time to make these decisions, Washington is going to side more so with Hamilton than he did Jefferson, which makes sense because Hamilton is the Secretary of the Treasury. I mean, this is the guy that was put in that position. But it is going to lead to some of this early animosity between the two political factions. The Whiskey Rebellion. One of the excise taxes that Hamilton had planned for as part of his financial strategy, his financial program for the country, was his 25% excise tax on whiskey. Now, in frontier regions, specifically here, we're talking about the western portions of Pennsylvania, this was going to hit them significantly hard. This was an area that, once you got across the Appalachians especially, not as much currency used for buying and selling. In fact, it was more of a barter economy in some places, in some small towns and villages and the like. For those places, it was going to be very difficult to collect an excise tax on a product they were selling when they didn't have money. I mean, when you're trading bushels of this for baskets of that and pints of this are equal to, it's difficult to assess that, and then without having the hard coin to collect, you can't then pay that money to the federal government. So there was opposition, to say the least. And in 1794, this is where Washington is going to gather up troops. He's going to muster up a small force, and they were going in there to put down the rebellion, and that's with air quotes as I'm saying it. They're putting down the rebellion. Now, the video we watched on Washington talked a little bit about this, and they painted you the picture that hopefully you were catching what they were saying, that the rebellion really wasn't a rebellion. There were people who opposed taxes, which if that's a rebellion, we have a rebellion every April, where we have people who don't want to pay their income taxes. No lives are lost. The soldiers are going to come in. Soldiers, are going to help force people to pay their taxes. I mean, they're going to be there to, impose the will of the government, if you will. The bottom line on this is gave federal government opportunity to show strength. That is what these excise taxes were all about. They weren't going to collect a significant amount of money, and it was really never about the money. It was about federal power, plain and simple. And this was an opportunity for them, again, to show the federal government has the power to tax you, and we have the power to force you to pay it. So, again, this was a power play. And, again, that's part of the Federalist program. Did the money go into the banking system? Did the money end up helping us get out of our debt? Okay, to a certain extent, yes. But it wasn't a significant amount of revenue being generated. This was about the power. I know when we first looked at this slide, commented about the picture and the fact that Little Turtle doesn't necessarily exude fierce warrior, but as the leader of the 8 Western tribes there in Ohio, think again Miami of Ohio, this Miami Confederacy was a pretty formidable force. In 1790, Washington sent General Josiah Harmer, and when he came to face the Miamis led by Little Turtle, he was sent home. He was defeated. In 1791, General Arthur St. Clair was sent to deal with the Miamis. He was defeated. Washington wasn't doing so well when it came to controlling the frontier. In 1792, he sends the third of his armies, and this one was led by Anthony Wayne. And it'll be Anthony Wayne that will be victorious finally against the Miamis. Now, Little Turtle himself was not present at the Battle of Fallen Timbers. Little Turtle believed, or he understood, that after the first 2 victories, they had a position of strength and was trying to negotiate from that position. And the other generals didn't, or the other chiefs didn't want to do that. But he wasn't at Fallen Timbers, and those generals that were soundly defeated by our Third Army that was sent. And the Miamis would be forced to sign the Treaty of Greenville, agreeing to cede most of the Ohio Territory. In return, we gave them annual payments of something like $10,000 or something like that, and agreements that they could have other lands that we would leave them alone. We mentioned this during this. It's not a significant battle. I mean, I guess it would be significant if you've got relatives who fought in it, maybe if you're from that region of Ohio. But I bring this up during the Washington administration primarily just to show that Washington's got different levels, and he's dealing with issues in different parts of the country. He's got the economic issues and programs going on with, battling with Hamilton and Jefferson. We've been negotiating treaties with England and France and dealing with them. You've got the natives on the frontier that you've got to deal with. Negotiations for right of deposit in Spain. I mean, there are a lot of layers to the presidency, and it's part of the reason why I say it's a 24 hours a day, 7-day a week, 365-day-a-year job. You can have a vacation, but you really are never off work, because as president, you're dealing with this stuff constantly. It also sets the tone for our Indian policy, where we defeat them, force them to sign a treaty, and then it won't take long for us to violate it. And then we defeat them, force them to sign a treaty, and then we'll violate it. And usually both sides violate these treaties. It's not just us, but let's be honest, our violation of the treaties were typically more egregious than theirs. When the French Revolution first started, there was going to be a lot of sentiment amongst the different states and the colonists here in America that wanted to support France. And the problem with that is the government that supported us during our revolution is not the government that was revolting in France. They were actually revolting against the government that supported us. But there's going to be this idea, because of the French government, because of the French Revolution, because it shared some of the same language the same ideals of overthrowing a monarchy. Um, there's going to be a push. There was a gentleman by the name of Edmund Genyi, Frenchman who came to the States trying to drum up support, and they established these Jacobin clubs across the United States for some men's organization, a men's club. They would go and they would drink manly drinks and talk politics, and they were very pro-French. And this Robespierre Reign of Terror time frame, the Jacobins that had seized power. But Washington looked at the radical aspect of the revolution going on in France and decided that that was not something he necessarily wanted to be a part of. As we know, if you took Western Civ, we talked about this. If you followed the Reign of Terror at all in there, you know that they're the group that beheaded the king and the queen. They declared war on all monarchs. They had the guillotine, lubed up, and they were using it on a weekly basis and getting rid of any political oppositions. And again, for Washington, that was a little too radical for him to get involved with. Furthermore, the idea of joining them in a war with England at this time, because again, the Reign of Terror, they declared war on all monarchies, not just their own. But now we're looking at the possibility of going to war with England again, with France, this time on their soil. Washington knew we weren't ready for this. Now, again, he's going to feel pressure. Jefferson, Secretary of State, who was very pro-French. Thomas Paine, very pro-French. They both actually wrote things that would be used by the French in the Revolution. But again, same time, Hamilton, our commerce is dependent upon England. They need to be what we're focusing on. That's the goal. Be like them. And so again, within the president's cabinet, you've got that conflict. But in April of 1793, Washington makes our first real foreign policy statement when he issued the Declaration of Neutrality. Again, we weren't going to get involved. Not our fight. Not everybody's going to be happy with that, but at the time, militarily speaking, it's one thing for us to wear the British out over a 7-year period on a war that was fought on our turf. That's one thing to do that. It's a totally different thing to take an army, get on a boat, take all your supplies with you, cross the ocean, and fight on somebody else's territory for somebody else's cause. That's a totally different thing. So again, Washington kind of understood that. He knew we weren't ready for that kind of a fight. So our first foreign policy decision, we declared ourselves neutral. Here are two treaties that were part of Washington's second term. The first one's simple. Thomas Pinckney negotiating with Spain, and it's about the idea of the right of deposit. Right of deposit is simply the right to trade. It means we can deposit goods there in that port to sell. Without a right of deposit, you can't buy or sell within a port. So anything that on the western side of the Appalachian Mountains basically was going to have to be traded through the port of New Orleans. You had to use the river system. It was faster to go down the Ohio and Mississippi and come out the Gulf of Mexico to get things to market. So without the right of deposit, that was going to be a very difficult thing for us to do. So Pinckney's Treaty, pretty simple. Right of deposit, trading in New Orleans. Jay's Treaty is a little more complicated, and it's not going to go down nearly as smooth with the American public. John Jay was sent to negotiate with England. You got the issues there. It's the same issues we're going to have throughout this period, all the way through the War of 1812. The British have never left the interior. They still have forts in the western states, in our western frontier. They were messing with our trading rights. They were restricting where we could and couldn't trade in other ports around the world. They were still seizing our ships while they were at sea, and taking the goods that we had. Impressment of sailors was still going on. Remember, that's kidnapping of the sailors, forcing them into military service for them. Also in the frontier, dealing with the Native Americans being incited to violence. The British were arming them, they were agitating them, and encouraging them to attack us on the frontier. The treaty itself is only going to cover a little bit of this. Most of the issues weren't dealt with. The language there that I've got on the slide is they call the treaty dishonorable. For Washington, this was a problem. Talked about in class one of a biography of his I read a couple of years ago, and the author was talked about the fact that his last term was not as smooth as the first term would be as far as getting things through Congress and working with people politically. This is going to be one of the problems. This is a treaty that he supported. Jay was one of his guys, and when people were negative in their reactions toward the treaty, Washington's going to be negative in his reaction towards them. And this is kind of the beginning where Washington was losing a little bit of his luster as president. Before, if Washington said it, it must be right. Well, we're starting to lose that here the deeper we get into his second term. So Jay's treaty, not going to be known as one of the better treaties that was ever negotiated. And for Washington, he's going to struggle with people challenging that. The election of 1796, in all actuality, is our first real election for the presidency. Washington was elected twice. I get that. He was elected unanimously twice in the Electoral College. But let's be honest, there really wasn't an election. Washington was running. Washington was going to win. So this was the election you weren't sure of. You've got the vice president under Washington and the secretary of state under Washington. And they're the leaders of the two opposition parties. Now, historically, a lot of people who don't know who won this automatically say Jefferson because a lot of people don't even remember John Adams was president, which is unfortunate. And also makes him kind of, a prophet whenever he said people would not remember him. But in this election, it's a close election. Adams will defeat Jefferson. Got the numbers there, 73-68. And at this time, under the Constitution, the original rules for presidential elections, the first place winner becomes the president, and the guy who comes in second place becomes vice president. So we do have a president of one party and a vice president of another, which is going to be one of the issues with the Constitution. It's a problem. When they wrote it, we didn't have political parties necessarily. We weren't thinking that way. So that was going to have to be addressed eventually, but not yet. So let's look at the presidency of John Adams then. Now, our video we watched on Adams talks about how he was probably the most qualified man as far as his background to be president, but his personality maybe made him the least qualified because of his temperament. When we talked about this in class, one of the things I did talk about was he did struggle with the idea of politics, the you help me and I'll help you kind of way of getting things accomplished. He was much more, I'm right, you're wrong, or we're doing this because it's the right reason, not for political gain. It's because it's supposed to be done, and he will struggle with some of those aspects of the presidency. One of the issues he was going to have to deal with right away was what became known as the X, Y, and Z affair. As the war was progressing between England and France, the French were becoming, I think the video said, particularly obnoxious. I like that phrasing. But the French had escalated their seizure of our ships and things like that when we were trying to exercise our rights of neutrality and trade with both sides. So President Adams sent a envoy to negotiate with the French. Again, this is Marshall, Charles Pinckney, Elbridge Gerry. And when they got there, they were rejected. They were told, that the French Foreign Minister Charles de Talleyrand was not going to meet with them. They go back to their hotel, and once they're at the hotel, there's a knock at the door, and there were three gentlemen there representing Talleyrand and the French government. And they had terms. If we wanted to secure a meeting with their foreign minister, we were going to have to give them $250,000. We were going to have to agree to multi-million-dollar loans, and we had to give a public apology for our President Adams, some comments, some anti-French comments he had made prior to their arrival. So they have a list of demands. Of course, we were offended by this. We returned to the United States, made the public aware that of this insult that we had been given by the French, and it becomes known as the XYZ affair. Instead of giving the people's names, we just simply said it was X, Y, and Z. Now, again, talked about this in class. This was not necessarily a atypical situation. I mean, this was normal for world powers to treat lesser nations. But again, we did not consider ourselves to be a lesser nation. So we were, highly offended by this. We just fought a war with the French. We'd signed the Treaty of Allegiances. We didn't see ourselves as being, just, some third-rate world, country coming and hoping to, have a meeting. No, we expected to be treated as an equal, and we weren't. So this is the beginning of the quasi-war, or the undeclared war, where our shipping and their shipping, we were going to exchange blows in the Atlantic for a couple of years. And there were going to be a lot of anti-French sentiment during this period. Now, for Adams, he didn't give in to this anti-French sentiment, and based on his personality, that's what's surprising here. Instead of taking the insult and then overreacting, instead he's going to send a second peace envoy over and continue this negotiations, trying to avoid the bloodshed of a war. Now again, there's fighting going on, but nothing like a war would have brought about, a full-scale war. Now, by not answering the call to go to war, Adams is going to take a hit politically from his own party. He's also going to take hits from the opposition party. But again, for Adams, it was about doing what he believed was right. And because if he believed it was right, that's his personality. He knew better. It's going to get him through this situation. But again, politically, there's going to be a lot of shots taken at him for not retaliating against the French. So that's the XYZ affair. Now, Adams does not like the opposition rhetoric. The Republicans were attacking him in the press. They were attacking him in Congress. And as president, he did not appreciate it. He did like anybody talking, badly about him. So he is going to work with his people in Congress and going to get some legislations passed here. And this is the Alien and Sedition Acts. This is how he's going to deal with that criticism. Just in general here, I've got 3 bullet points for you as far as raising the residency requirements for citizenship. A lot of the people who were becoming citizens in this, in the United States, were joining the Republican Party. So they were joining the opposition. So they made it more difficult to become a citizen. The numbers went, I think, from 5 years to 14 years residency. Then you got to allow a president to deport people. You've got you're setting fines and jail terms for expressing anti-government opinions. I mean, you're flying in the face of the First Amendment: freedom of speech, freedom of press, freedom of petition, freedom of assembly, because doing any of those things could have been considered a violation of the Alien Sedition Act, depending on what side you were protesting. So this is a clear violation of our First Amendment rights at the time. Now, the Republicans are going to have a response to that. And the response is in the form of the Virginia and the Kentucky resolutions, and they're authored by Jefferson and Madison. They're going to support this idea of nullification, or doctrine of nullification, stating that a state could decide what acts of Congress to follow and what acts to nullify. Basically saying Congress could choose what federal laws they were going to listen to. Which is surprising when you think that Madison was a Federalist to begin with when it came to ratification of the Constitution. And he was a Federalist because he wanted a strong central government. But now that he's on the opposition side, he's looking to limit some of that power. Now this violates the Supremacy Clause, Article 6, Section 2 of the Constitution. They honestly believed that other states would follow suit, but they didn't. Now, this is a violation of the Constitution. What Adams was doing is a violation of the Constitution as well. Now, this one says made states' rights an issue for years to come. This idea of what the states can and can't do, this is a reoccurring theme throughout this unit, throughout this term. We'll see it in the growth of the nation with the Tariff of Abomination in South Carolina. We will see it again prior to the Civil War, throughout the Civil War, and it's still in existence today. When you look at issues like who gets to determine what marriage is, does the federal government have the right to mandate health care? Those are all considered states' rights arguments. So it's kind of the beginning of that. Well, the who made who has power over who, power struggle between a federal government and the state governments. The election of 1800, Adams versus Jefferson, Part 2. This one was really less about Adams versus Jefferson, as it's going to be the Republican attempt to control the outcome of the vice presidency. By 1800, both sides have tried to game the system. They don't want a situation where a president of one party and then he is stuck with a vice president from the opposition. So both sides are going to run multiple candidates with the intent of one of them being the vice president. With Adams, it was Aaron Burr. He was the Republican vice presidential candidate. But under the old system of the Electoral College, the electors cast two votes, but there was no way to distinguish or no way to determine which one was for president, which one was for vice president. I mean, you couldn't say that. They just cast two votes. And some electors were supposed to not cast their second vote, or possibly cast their second vote for somebody other than Burr to make sure Burr doesn't win, but he comes in second. For whatever reason, they tied. So because Burr and Jefferson come in with the same number of electoral votes, we don't have a president. In this situation, the House of Representatives gets to pick. They send the top three candidates to the House, and each state represented in the House gets one vote. It's during this voting process that things got interesting. By 1800, Jefferson had accumulated quite a few enemies. And there were enemies in Congress. And it's politics. And the longer you're in it, the more likely you are to have enemies. It took 36 votes for them to choose Thomas Jefferson over Aaron Burr. And it finally came down to Hamilton intervening, and he made the statement to the members of Congress that were Federalists that there was none of them who had any more reason than he to hate Jefferson. Jefferson and Hamilton had been battling for years over control of the government. And he's sitting there saying, I have more reason than anybody to hate this man. But at the same time, he's the right man for the job. Hamilton threw his support behind Jefferson. He regarded Burr as an unscrupulous rogue who did not believe he had the temperament, the personality, the mentality to be president. This is going to be the beginning of the feud between Hamilton and Burr, which will culminate in their duel, in which Burr did kill Hamilton eventually, but that's going to be a few years down the road. The way this played out does lead to us adding another amendment to the Constitution. 12th Amendment establishes, the presidential ticket, if you will, that the president and vice president run as a unit, and you cast one vote for the unit, not two votes, one for each of them. So we do get an electoral change after the election of 1800. Before Jefferson can take office, Adams wasn't quite done yet. Now, the election takes place in the fall of 1800, but Jefferson doesn't take office until March the 4th, leaving Adams a significant amount of time here to continue his presidency. He's going to oversee the passage of the Judiciary Act of 1801, which is going to add, I believe it's 16 positions to the court, 16 new judges. Those are 16 positions that carry with them a lifetime term of office. So adding those 16 positions was pretty significant at the time. One of the other things that he's going to do is nominate and get the approval for John Marshall to become our next Chief Justice. He's the third Chief Justice overall, but Marshall's going to be the most significant Chief Justice of our Supreme Court. He's going to serve for about 33, 34 years as a Federalist. He's going to oversee the courts and continue the Federalist legacy. For a president, a Supreme Court nomination, federal court nominations are important, but a Supreme Court nomination exceptional. And this is one of those, he picked the right guy for the Federalist. One of the key decisions he's going to make early on is the case of Marbury versus Madison. And it's going to help establish this idea of judicial review. I'm not going to get into the details of the case. You've got that in your packet. But in the court decision, he being Chief Justice Marshall, is going to extend this power of the court and create this idea of judicial review. Again, not in the language of the Constitution, but it's based on his interpretation of the powers of the court, giving him and the court the authority to look at lower court cases and either uphold or overturn them, to look at legislation and declare unconstitutional. Marshall is the guy who defines the power of the court. And with all these judges, all this stuff that was happening prior to Adams leaving and Jefferson taking power, the Republicans don't like it. They knew exactly what it was. It was a power grab by the Federalists as they were leaving. But again, legally, there was nothing they could do to stop it. And for Adams, Marshall is going to be that appointee that is going to carry out his ideas for the next third of the century. So during Jefferson's inaugural address, he has the line, "We are all Republicans, we are all Federalists, we are all Americans," trying to bring the Federalists into the fold and all that fun stuff. But it was about bringing small government. It's about bringing Republican principles to Washington. Again, I've got the statements there: wise and frugal government, balancing budget, cutting taxes, all those excise taxes that Hamilton wanted as part of his early financial policy. Those are gone. Eliminating spending, less formal, all the things we talked about with Jefferson, and the video talked about Jefferson. That's what we know as the Jeffersonian Revolution. He was going to bring that simplicity to the White House. Until this happens. Louisiana Purchase. France was going to be regaining Louisiana territory, and again, it's a transfer of power from Spain back to France. It says they're 1800, but that's when we're finding out about it. The transfer itself is not going to take place until 1803. We're going to send James Monroe over. Robert Livingston's going to be involved. James Monroe is going to be involved. We attempted to buy this for $2 million. They said no. Turns out that Napoleon actually had an idea that he wanted to create a new France, but then sent an army over to Haiti to put down a rebellion. The army's going to, or a large portion of the army contracted yellow fever and died. Napoleon's going to lose interest in New France, mainly because he needed money to fight a war against Great Britain again. When we countered the offer, and $5 million, then we went to $10 million, which was all that we were allowed to negotiate. When we sent our people, that was the cap, $10 million. And again, we're only trying to buy New Orleans. And then they countered with the idea of $15 million for everything. Now, we're going to have to take the offer, and eventually will. But for Jefferson, this was a struggle because it violated his principles of small government. He was doing that as president. He was kind of exceeding his authority, making this kind of a big land deal without Congress's approval for the money. And he's going to struggle with this idea because everything that he had ran for, everything he had said as a Republican, he was contradicting himself by making this decision, but at the same time, it was what was best for the country. So we were going to buy the Louisiana territory. We don't exactly know what we bought other than New Orleans. We know the Mississippi, but as far as how far west, we didn't know. As far as how far north, we don't know. That's going to have to be negotiated between us and Spain and us and Great Britain. The other thing we don't know is exactly what was in what we bought. And that's where Lewis and Clark comes in. Now, Meriwether Lewis, William Clark, going to be sent out to begin this exploration of the territory itself. Carried out scientific studies, kept detailed journals. They're going to map the region. Their journals, again, the artwork in it, of all the different plants and vegetation, the animals, the insects, everything. Detailed journals, topography in the maps, the bends in the river and and the mountainous terrain and all those different things. None of it happens unless they get the help from the Shoshone woman, Sacagawea. She's going to be their interpreter. She's going to be a mediator. She's going to be a guide. Without her, the success of Lewis and Clark's travels, they don't have it. They aren't going to have the success they had. But in 2.5 years, they'll make their way to the Pacific and back, and it's through this exploration that they're going to show, again, that it says their potential for Western expansion. Going to spark that, that idea. Going to spark we needed to move into that territory, and it's not going to take long for us, especially trappers and the like, to head out into that region and begin, trapping and claiming that territory as ours. There is a similarity between Washington and Jefferson when it comes to their final year in office, or final years in office. Both are going to struggle in their second term, and both can't wait for their presidency to get over with. For Jefferson, it's dealing with England again. It's the same issues as we saw before. Seizure of ships at sea, impressment of sailors, incitement of Indians, and Jefferson just doesn't want to deal with it. instead of negotiating and potentially going to war with Great Britain, he's going to pass the Embargo Act, where we outlawed all foreign trade. Well, that doesn't hurt England. That's not going to stop England. All that's going to do is hurt us. That hurts our trade. It's going to hurt our agricultural exports. So, this is going to make nobody happy in the United States. So that doesn't work. They rescind that, and then we bring in the Non-Intercourse Act. Well, fine. Then we just aren't going to trade with England and France, because that's where the problem is. We try to trade with England and France, and that's when we run into the seizure of ships and pressmen and all that stuff. But again, they're our two biggest trading partners. England is our biggest trading partner. So that's not going to work, and that's not going to be popular. So what he's leaving Madison is a significant problem here. And while this is going on, we've got issues in the West with Native Americans. We've got young members of Congress that are challenging authority, and that young members calling for war, calling for an expansion, calling for controlling that Midwest region. And again, for Jefferson, March 4th of 1809 couldn't get here near fast enough. Now we're getting a little closer to home, dealing with the Indiana Territory. 1811, we got some issues with a new Indian Confederacy, the Shawnee Confederacy, led by Tecumseh. And we're going to watch a video in class dealing with Tecumseh. Part of that is going to be his relative that becomes known as the Shawnee Prophet, Wallalithaka, the Tenskatawa. You watch the video, you understand what I'm talking about there. But the Shawnee Prophet is going to begin this idea that the natives need to quit being dependent on trade with the British or trade with the Americans, that they've become soft and spoiled with manufactured goods, and they need to get back to the old ways. Not the first or the last time we're going to see these types of movements within the Native American community, but the Shawnee Prophet's going to bring a lot of different tribes into this, and Tecumseh was the military leader that was going to make this viable. They will battle with William Henry Harrison. And again, if you've been to Vincennes, to Grouseland, that was Harrison's home. Vincennes was the territorial, side of the territorial government for Indiana. The Wabash River was the tributary they used for trade because it connects the Ohio to the Mississippi. But the big battle takes place between the Shawnee Confederacy and William Henry Harrison in November of 1811. It's the Battle of Tippecanoe Creek at Prophetstown, Indiana. It's where the Shawnee had their fort or had their encampment. Harrison attacked Tecumseh's village. Tecumseh wasn't there. Tecumseh was in the southern parts of the United States trying to recruit more tribes to come and join. But Tecumseh would end up fighting with the British during the War of 1812 and fought bravely for them. But you'll get more information, obviously, from the video from what I just gave. But it showed the Native Americans' willingness to fight for their lands. We'd moved them from Ohio to Indiana, and now we're in Indiana. So for some of the Native Americans, it becomes obvious that we weren't going to let them be. We were always going to be continuing to move west, following them. Tecumseh also, he had his whole strategy was kind of based on what we had done in the Revolution. We were kind of that group that he looked to and saw that the loose confederation of colonies were successful of defeating the British, and thought that they could be successful against the United States, but it's not going to work out for him. The War of 1812 is sometimes referred to as Mr. Madison's War because, one, this is the first time that we are going to declare war as a new nation. It's a formal declaration of war. Congress declares it after President Madison asked for that. It goes back to those reasons we've talked about already. It's they were inciting our Indians, they were crippling our economy, they were stealing our ships and impressing our sailors and all that stuff that was going on. There's an aspect of this as well. We were trying to get Canada to help us and jump onto our side or potentially become part of us as well, which that's not going to work well at all. It's not really even that. It never really was that viable of a plan. But the war itself, June 18th, 1812 through February 18th of 1815. The treaty itself will be signed in December of 1814, but it's going to take the final aspects of the war to be over with there. 2 phases, and England's going to dictate both phases. So let's look at those 2 phases. When I say that England's going to dictate the phases of the war, it's based on what else they've got going on around the world. For the first 2 years of this, they're also fighting France. Now, if you were fighting a war with 2 countries, one of them is in your backyard, the other one's an ocean away, your focus is probably the one that's in your backyard. So that first stages of the war for the British, it was about defending their territory, in this case, Canada. And they're going to do what the British always do. They're going to throw up a naval blockade. They'll use their navy on the coastline, but they weren't looking at full-scale invasions because they learned that during the Revolution, the deeper in the interior they got, the less success they have. So they're going to use their navy, hit-and-run raids along the coast, and try to cripple our economy, which probably wasn't going to be too difficult because our economy wasn't in great shape anyway, and just hang on to what they had. Now, for us, this is a positive because they did not try a full-out invasion because our army was in horrible shape. We have no leadership at this point. I mean, you think about the leaders we had during the Revolution, they'd been planning for this. I mean, through the 73, 74, the militias were training, and then 75, we get the Continental Army and Washington, and we had Nathaniel Greene and Ethan Allen, and the list goes on and on about the different generals that we had. But we had generals that had experience. I mean, Washington had experience fighting both with and against the British by the end. Charles Lee was like that as well. Benedict Arnold, Horatio Gates, all had something going for them militarily. And yeah, I did say Horatio Gates because he did win Saratoga, kind of, sort of, maybe. But anyway, we don't even have that. The military leadership we have at this point is not going to be ready. Our army not ready. It says their militias refused to cross state lines. We don't necessarily even have a standing army yet. We'll have a little bit of success with our Navy, but that's about it. So we're fortunate that the British did not have a full-scale, full-on attack against us here in 1812, or otherwise this war could have ended much, much differently. The Battle of Lake Erie is where we get Oliver Hazard Perry, the famous line, from the battle flag, "Don't give up the ship." He is going to outmaneuver and pretty much just out-admiral the British squadron there. And I believe I read somewhere this was the first time, the first time in history that an entire British naval squadron had surrendered. So with this, it's about taking control of Lake Erie. We had Lake Champlain, and it's the victory at Lake Erie is going to then set up the victory for the Army at the Battle of the Thames, where William Henry Harrison was going to be successful. And this actually at the Battle of the Thames, in which Tecumseh himself was killed fighting for the British. Once the British were able to defeat the French in the spring of 14, they could turn their full attention on us. And this is the old divide and conquer strategy. They're going to move one army from Canada moving south. They're going to move one army up through the Gulf of Mexico to attack New Orleans and move north. The third group was going to use the Navy, and this is the part that most people remember about the War of 1812 itself, is these hit-and-run raids along our coastal cities. And one of those raids will end up in Washington, D.C., and this is the famous burning of the White House. The stories about the Army attacking, and as the president was getting ready to sit down for dinner, and the British officers actually sitting down and eating that dinner, or toasting Madison with his own wine. There are stories about Dolly Madison saving the portrait of Washington. Some passersby with the wagon were like, Mrs. President, can we help you? Mrs. Madison, can we help you? And yes, save the president, save the portrait of the general, or something to that effect. But they had to rip it off the wall because it was so big, it was bolted to the walls, and they had to have a cart to carry it out. But the destruction of our capital, of the White House, was a big deal, and that's one of those images that people see, and that's why some people regard the loss, or the War of 1812, to be a loss, because they did burn our capital. But that was the only part of this plan that was going to be successful, because their army moving from Canada and then up through New Orleans, neither one will be successful at completing their goal. Probably the most famous battle for something other than the battle itself is the Battle of Fort McHenry. Fort McHenry is protecting the harbor in Baltimore, Maryland. There's the dates, September 12th through 15th in 1814. But it's famous because of the song. Francis Scott Key, local lawyer, was there negotiating the release of some prisoners, was held on one of the British ships during the battle, and it's his poem that becomes the Star-Spangled Banner that eventually becomes our national anthem. The first verse, all four verses, dealing with the battle itself, but the first verse is what we use as our national anthem. So when he's talking about the rockets' red glare, bombs bursting in air, they flew through the night, but our flag was still there. The British did have crude rockets at this time that didn't leave a red trail behind them. So the rockets' red glare was, again, he was seeing this. Now, the flag itself, you'll notice the flag on the background, and the flag that's in the front right corner of my classroom, right by the door, it's the one that's hanging vertically. It is one of the Star-Spangled Banners. It's 15 stars, 15 stripes. That's the Star-Spangled Banner. At that point, we were still adding a stripe for every new state as well. But they had this massive garrison flag that flew over Fort McHenry. Now, again, they've told experts and historians believe now that was not flying over Fort McHenry that night because the weather was bad. It was raining, and they didn't have all-weather flags back then, so they would have had a smaller flag flying, because the massive flag that was usually flying overhead, when it got wet, it would have weighed well over 500 pounds of soaking wet cloth that would have snapped the flagpole. So it's not the big, massive flag that was flying overhead during the battle, but still, it's Francis Scott Key that does tell us the story of the battle itself from his perspective in the harbor. And the idea was that he would not be able to see the flag the next morning, as he was told by the British, that they were going to take that fort and that your flag will be gone. Well, that's "Oh, say can you see by dawn's early light what so proudly we hailed in the twilight's last gleaming." He's saying, can you see the flag? And at the end of the day, we are going to win the battle. British were turned back, and we've got a poem that will eventually become our national anthem. The last two battles here. First one is the Battle of Lake Champlain. This is what stops the northern invasion. Keeps that army from Canada moving into our our territory. The second of those battles is the Battle of New Orleans. The Battle of New Orleans is significant because of the date. At least I think it's significant because of the date. The thing that we're going to get out of the Battle of New Orleans, other than the really cool song, was Andrew Jackson does become a hero. Andrew Jackson becomes a household name in America because of the overwhelming victory we're going to have here. But again, I think the date's more significant. But these are the battles. Excuse me. These are the battles that stopped the northern and the southern invasion. This is why I said that the date was the most significant aspect of the Battle of New Orleans. Madison had sent an envoy over to negotiate with the British at this time. This was a war that neither side really wanted to be fighting at this point in time. I heard a professor once talking about the War of 1812, saying that had the telephone been invented in 1812, this war never would have happened. That the policies, the things that the British were doing that we didn't like, if we'd have been able to talk real time with the British in 1812, this war probably never happens. Because neither of us really needed it. Neither one of us were really in a position to fight this the way it should be fought. They were fighting another war at the time, and we just weren't prepared for it. So we were actually negotiating a peace settlement prior to the Battle of New Orleans. So December 24th of 1814, they officially declared an armistice. The problem is communications. And had the Battle of New Orleans, had they been able to get word to both the British and the Americans fighting in the Battle of New Orleans in January that the war itself was over, if that battle doesn't happen, Andy Jackson probably doesn't become president, because that's really going to be the springboard for him to become president of the United States, was the fame from being the hero of New Orleans. But we declared an armistice. We returned to the idea of status quo, which we returned to the way things were before. The issues we had, the trade disputes, the border issues, and anything like that, we agreed to come back and negotiate those separately. We just both agreed to stop fighting. So that's why I like to, I think of the War of 1812 as not a victory as much as a draw, because at the end we didn't gain anything, we didn't really lose anything tangible. We didn't lose money, we didn't lose land, we're still independent. But when you start looking at this, using time, that whole hindsight mentality, one of the things we did gain is a sense of national pride. And I've got these things listed down there in red. We did stand up to Great Britain once again. We did fight the fight. Now again, we didn't defeat them, but we didn't lose to them. And again, England's still a world power. We did gain some respect from Great Britain for standing up to them. And our relationship with Great Britain will continue to improve after this. And they will become the ally that we have grown accustomed to them being. In your lifetime, my lifetime, Great Britain's always been an ally. Well, the foundation for that is the War of 1812. And it's, that foundation's built on the respect. But the other thing we learned was that the United States, if we were ever going to be any kind of a world power, we had to be self-sufficient. We were going to have to make some changes. We were going to have to grow. We were going to have an internal infrastructure. There was going to be some things that needed to happen. But being self-sufficient was going to have to be a priority for us over the next several years. That's pretty much it as far as the notes are concerned for this. Again, we watched a couple of videos. The President's video is online. Unfortunately, I do not have a copy of the Tecumseh video to put online. I wish I did, but it's not out there. Nobody's put it up on YouTube or anything yet. So hopefully everybody's here for that. You'll get that information, or we can make arrangements otherwise. But that's where we're at. Hopefully this video helps in your preparation for the test, and hopefully you learned a little something. So thank you.